So we're in the middle of the 8th chapter. We're dealing with what sort of quantity is material for carrying on Shabbat. We're not going to carry in the public domain on Shabbat, but gosh, if we're looking at quantities, well, if I carry a couple of breadcrumbs in my pocket, is that material? In other words, what is the real definition of the carrying? And the 8th chapter is interesting because it goes through lots and lots of different materials, defining what's a critical mass for carrying on Shabbat. And we learned about rope, we learned about reeds, we learned about paper, we learned about erased paper. And now as we pick up the 3rd Mishnah in the 8th chapter, we're going to get into leather. So we're going from paper to leather to parchment, actually. And in each case, throughout this chapter, we're following the same principle, which is that in order to reach critical mass for carrying on Shabbat, it has to be something which is useful. The principle articulated is that it had to be something that people will bother storing. And that's a general principle, but we're seeing as the Mishnah goes through all these examples that the fundamental principle it's working to is a question of utility. Can I use this object? And so it goes. Or, that's leather. Kedei lasot kamea. Leather enough to write an amulet. Cloth, that's parchment. Kedei lichtov alav parsha ketana sheb'tefillin. Parchment, the minimal quantity is what you could write the short passage of the tefillin, which is Shema Yisrael. Dio, ink. Lichtov shtei otiyot. Maybe that's related, by the way, to the fact that writing 2 letters on Shabbat is essentially the defining, it's the definition of the Av Malacha, the archetypal labor of Shabbat. I remember I gave the example actually of joining 2 boards together, and Rabbi Herzfeld commented on text. I didn't have time to look at this during the meeting, but he said, Rabbi Herzfeld commented, and this is quite right, that once you've written 2 letters, you've written a word. So, for example, yad is a word with 2 letters. Yes, if you've got ink to write 2 letters, you can write a word. Whereas I can't think of any word that only has 1 letter. Kol is blue in modern Hebrew, but it's eyeshadow. Kol is eyeshadow. Well, what's the minimal quantity of eyeshadow? Well, according to the Mishnah, kedei lichrol ein echat, in order to make one, to decorate one eye, to blue out one eye. Why are we going to blue out just one eye? Well, apparently there were very modest people in those days who used to go out veiled, and they would cover one eye. And by the way, I've seen a reference to this, in fact, in halachic literature describing a woman taking an aliyah from the women's gallery of a shul in Morocco. And this letter describes a woman coming down from the women's gallery, but with her face completely veiled. And then she'd approach the men, she'd go through the men's section and take an aliyah. So eyeshadow for one eye. Glue, devek, kedeli ten barosh hashav shevet. Glue for putting on top of a small twig. This seems to be something to do with hunting birds. At least that's how the commentators explain it. If you were a bird hunter, you might put glue onto the top of a twig or on top of a board on top of a twig, and then you hope that the birds will jump on it and get stuck. But anyway, that's the minimal quantity of glue which is useful. Interesting, it doesn't refer to glue for fixing things. But when we get on to pitch and sulfur, zephet, vigofrit, kedei lasot nekev, to make a small hole. And the Mishnah clearly is talking here about fixing a small hole. It's not talking about making a small hole. And in the same line, sha'ava kedei liten al pi nekev katan, clay for wax for putting it over a small hole. And then charsit kedei lasot pikur sheltzor fezahav, clay for making a hole in a gold refiner's pot. And again, I think we're talking about covering up the hole, covering up a hole in a gold refiner's pot, rather than actually making the hole. And Rabbi Yudas says making it a something called a pit put, which is, I think is translated as a tripod's leg, but I'm not sure about that. Bran. Now, we've seen bran before in the definitions of something which is not food. Remember when we learned about the quantity of food that is critical for carrying on Shabbat, we said it does not include bran, and the subin is mentioned there. Subin kadeli tenal. So subin is not food. It's bran is not food, but kadeli tenal pi chur shel sorfei zahav. We're using it for the same purpose. We're going to use the bran for sealing up the mouth of a gold refiner's pot. And now we get into cosmetics. Seed. This is lime. Lime enough to smear the smallest of girls. And we seem to be talking here about a depilatory. It seems to be something to remove hair. And Rabbi Yehuda says it's to take off the hair on the temples, and Rabbi Nehemiah says it's to take off the hair of the forehead, and somehow the andife and the kilkul seem to be different kinds of definitions, different kind of curls, different sorts of hair people would have, and they'd use a depilatory on it. And then Adama, earth. Why would you need earth? Kechotem hamartsupim, earth for a seal on a merchandise bag, according to Rabbi Akiva. And the sages say, Kechotem ha'igrot, the sages say for a seal on a letter. And by the way, as we get further now into this chapter, we see a series of arguments between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Perhaps, there is a commentator who suggests, look, at the beginning of the chapter, the editors didn't want to confuse us too much with dialectic, but now we're getting towards the end of the chapter. We'll see this argument play out again and again. Zevel, v'chol dak, manure or thin sand for kadela zevel kelach shel kruv, to fertilize a cabbage stalk, according to Rabbi Akiva. And the sages say, okay, to fertilize a leek, a kresha is a leek, and I don't know whether Rabbi Akiva or whether the sages are stricter or more lenient. I'm not sure which is a larger quantity of manure. And then that's
a leek is smaller than cabbage.
Thank you. A leek is smaller than a cabbage. So Rabbi Akiva is makil, actually, in terms of what he says we can. The sages are stricter in terms of what we carry on Shabbat. Thank you. So that's thin sand. Well, thick sand. Okay, we'd use thick sand to make as a building, to mix with plaster to make mortar. Chol hagas kadeli ten al melo chafsid. Thick sand, as much as you'd put on a full, basically a full plaster trowel. And kane kadela sot kulmos. So a reed, as much reed as you could make a pen out of. Okay, what if it was the kind of reed that you couldn't make a pen out of? So, if the reed isn't suitable to make a pen, what else could we do with it? Well, maybe we could sort of pile it up and crush it and light it and cook with it. Maybe we could use reeds as fuel if they are not of sufficient quality to make a pen out of them. And so the Mishnah is going to tell us, Ve'im haya av or murusam kadei levashel bo beitza kala sheba beitzim. Enough. How much is a critical mass quantity? Well, as much as you'd require to cook the lightest of eggs. Trufa utnutna ba'il pas, beaten up and placed into a stew pot. So that's the end of the fifth Mishnah. And then we will continue with these examples till the end of the chapter, end of the 8th chapter. We have 2 more Mishnayot in the 8th chapter. And then the Mishnah is going to take a sudden diversion before coming back to more of these examples at the end of the 9th chapter.